بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Welcome to Thursday night, the women's class. We're doing Riyadh al-Saliheen, Gardens of the Righteous, and we are still in the chapter of patience, but we're nearing the end and we're dealing with a lot of hadith about anger. So without further ado, away we go. Okay, we finished the hadith. Okay, I believe we left off with the hadith on Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, that he said the Prophet ﷺ said the strong man is not the one who is good at wrestling, but the strong man is one who controls himself in a fit of rage. And we were specifically talking about parenting, right? A hot topic, and children, and the moderation that Allah expects of all of us in everything, especially anger, and that there's a difference between being angry for ourselves versus angry for the sake of Allah, and how anger for the sake of ourselves is required when it comes to jihad, when it comes to establishing justice on earth, sympathizing or empathizing with the oppressed, etc., etc. But when it's about our own, anger can easily be an ego trip, right? It can easily be about us and about our hurt pride and about etc., etc. And that is blameworthy. And how the Prophet ﷺ stressed controlling that latter type of anger, even if the first one has its own use. And this is a textbook example of that particular type of guidance and instruction, where the Prophet ﷺ is not talking about every single type of anger. He's talking about being angry for yourself, right? Selfish reasons, for the ego, right? Strength, true strength, is in controlling that type of anger, because that is the type of anger that the devil seeks to incite and seeks to inflame and seeks to aggrandize and develop in us, as opposed to righteous anger, which is supposed to be directed towards establishing justice on earth. So we had talked about that. And then the next hadith, 46. Sulaiman ibn Surad said that I was sitting with the Prophet ﷺ when two men began to quarrel and curse each other. And the face of one of those two men turned red, and the veins in his neck were swollen from rage. The Messenger of Allah ﷺ saw this and said, I know of a word that if he were to utter it, if he's going to say it, then his rage will die down. And that is, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. I seek refuge with Allah from the devil, the accursed. So the companion said to him, the Prophet ﷺ tells you to say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. And that's where the hadith ends. We don't get the rest of the story, but we assume that it worked. So some of the points to take from this hadith, the first is that this type of anger, again, as we just said, the type of anger that is not rooted in justice, but is rooted in the self, in the nafs, in the ego, our reputation, our sense of pride, our sense of what we deserve. This is the type of anger that needs to be controlled, and this is the type of anger that the devil wants to develop and aggravate. Right? So the reason why it's powerful, the reason why it's a powerful technique to say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, is because that is the source of this type of anger. Why is that the source of this type of anger? Because usually when we're angry, it's not so, this is not the noble type of anger that we're talking about. it's not so much about what the other person did or said as it is what it means to us, right? And what it means to us is suggested to us by the devil. Have you ever gotten into an argument with your spouse and they say something that's, could be interpreted a couple different ways? And the particular interpretation that you choose to hear their statement through is something that hurts you, right? So for example, I'll give an example from my own life. That way we make it real. Okay? Maybe I'm tired during the day and I'm trying to just kind of lay down and relax. And the wife is also having a challenging day. And she asks me to change a diaper, or she asks me to do the dishes. And then because I'm tired and because all these etc. reasons and excuses, at the very least, let's say I don't jump at the opportunity, right? I'm not at that level of taqwa yet, where I recognize my opportunity for reward with Allah and I rise the occasion and smiling with, my face beaming, say, of course, my dear beloved wife, I will do this and more for you, etc., etc. No, I probably sigh, I probably huff and puff. I might even say, maybe like I'll do it later, 5 minutes, etc., etc. Okay. And then that sort of behavior can easily be interpreted as, okay, he doesn't respond to me. He doesn't heed my kind of like take care of my needs proactively, right? I've seen him respond with more urgency and immediacy to other things that aren't what would make my life easier. Therefore, he values my happiness less than he values those other things, right? All these sorts of interpretations, right? These sorts of things, as opposed to, and this is how we can distinguish the satanic suggestions from reality, because every satanic suggestion could have a valid excuse on the other side, right? Instead of, he's tired, he had a hard day, etc., etc. And I should have picked an example that was the opposite, that was incriminating of myself. Let me press rewind there and let's go to an example that's more incriminating of myself, right? I asked my wife for whatever, to make a cup of coffee for me. And she's got the baby in her arm and she's doing this and the one kid is tugging on her or whatever. And she's like, could you please just do it yourself today? Right. And maybe she's not the most kind when she says that because she's getting screamed at by the kids. Right. And then if I were to be, here we go, this is better because it's, if I were to be, oh, you don't put yourself forward in the service of your husband, and this is not how, I can even give it a little religious veneer and say this is not how the Salaf were, and this is not how the companions were. They were trying to strive in the service of their husbands, right? Things like that. This means that you don't care for me. This means that you don't, etc., etc., etc. Those are satanic suggestions. Yes. Often, if not always, satanic suggestions. Whereas the reality is that if I had made excuses, I would have said, okay, obviously she's having a hard day. Obviously the kids are making her nuts and she's got her hands full right now. And my coffee is not like very high on her priority list. And it's not because she doesn't love me or care for me. It's just because everybody else is kind of like fraying her nerves, right? So this is exactly the type of role that the devil plays when it comes to our arguments, especially with anybody, but especially with our spouses and relatives, right? Those choices of interpretation, right? If I'm going to take, because I'm not just understanding like what she said at face value. It's not like I asked her for a cup of coffee and she just said no. I said, oh, okay. And I go and make it myself, or I go out and I buy one. That would be taking it at face value. It's all of the meanings and that I attach and that I interpret from that act. Oh, this is a symbol that this person values this other thing more than me, or this is a symbol that they don't care enough for me, or I see how there's an asymmetry here. This person is acting more favorably to this other thing than to me, etc., etc. Right? This is the ego. This is the ego, and the devil is very, very, very ready to exploit this, and to use it against us, and to fan those flames. Like, so the devil will suggest to us, like, that's right. Did you notice how when we had guests over last time, she hopped up and made coffee right away, right? So look at that. She's trying to, she cares more about impressing other people and the guests than she cares about you, right? Or the kids are always getting, their thing before you do. And did you remember when you visited this other family the other week? Oh, look at how the father or the head of the household was honored and he got everything first, etc., right? All those sorts of suggestions are from none other than the devil. And that's what hurts. Not the actual thing that our spouse said. That's what hurts, what it could mean, what it could symbolize, what it could signify. And that's what gets us hurt. That's what gets us sad. That's what gets us angry and upset. And that is what the devil wants. Yes, he wants us to seize upon that worst interpretation and let it hurt us, let it burn, and then react. So this is why it's so effective, the prophetic guidance, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to say, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim." Like, I seek refuge in Allah from the accursed devil, right? Because the devil is the one that's kind of egging us on to adopt these specific interpretations and let us make mountains out of molehills. We also see the wisdom of the Prophet ﷺ because, and this is something that I hadn't noticed until right now, he doesn't tell the man directly, but he passes it along through the grapevine, right? The companions are the ones who deliver the message, and that has to be from wisdom. There has to be some sort of dynamic that's not explicitly stated here, where it would have been more effective or better in somehow to let the companions handle it and let word get, I mean, maybe it was about saving face, who knows? Maybe it was a little bit more easy for the offending parties to hear it from the companions than it was to hear it directly from the Prophet ﷺ himself, who knows? But those things are always present, lurking underneath the surface. The next hadith, 47. Oh, this is a good one. Here we go. This is a good one for the women's class. Let's do it. Mu'adh ibn Anas radiallahu anhu said, the Prophet ﷺ said, the one who suppresses his anger and has the power to give effect to it, meaning like he's not just angry and he's harmless. Like, this is somebody who has the ability to harm, right? And that could mean lots of things. That could mean that they are in a leadership position, or they have the ability, maybe it's physical strength, maybe it's weaponry, who knows? It could be any sort of thing. They have the ability to punish people, physically or otherwise. Somebody who gets angry and they have the power to act on that anger, they will be called out by Allah the Exalted to the front of all the creatures on the day of resurrection, and that person will be given their free choice of hur al-ain, right? The virgins of paradise, to his liking. And this is in Abu Dawood and At-Tirmidhi. Okay, here we go. What on earth are the hur al-ain? What are the damsels of paradise, the virgins, right? And why is it part of our tradition? Like, are these literal? What's the point in them being virgins? Why is it something that Allah stresses, right? We all, like, I'd like to hear your thoughts about this, because this is something that Orientalists and Westerners in general seize upon because it makes them very uncomfortable, right? It's like, oh my God, like, this is we knew it was true. Like, the Muslim men are just rabid savages that are just, violent and misogynistic, and they're only motivated by their base lusts, right? So Yeah, it's hard. That's a pretty big question. Let's say, why are there hurul ain? Why are there these wide-eyed damsels in paradise? Isn't that unfair to women? What do women get? Where's the wide-eyed studs in paradise for women? I will not proceed until someone gives me their thoughts. Okay, Allah shows modesty for women because of the nature of men's jealousy. So is the implication that I think what you're saying is that to talk about female sexual desire is something that is violating the respect for women and modesty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has of them, or let's say violating the jealousy of men. I didn't even think about it from that angle, but that's certainly true. I believe women do have almost same reward, but also women have other desires than men. Good. Okay. Very important point there. We're going to expand on that in a second. Women have other desires than men. Okay, good. Women have the same reward. Good. That's a very good default rule when we're talking about Islamic law. So then why are men specifically targeted here in the hadith? Why didn't the Prophet ﷺ have a hadith about women controlling their anger and thus being rewarded with something that's particular to women? Number one, men are more prone to anger. That's true. And number two is women subvert in other ways. Yeah, mashallah. Yes. Oh, okay. So number two, women subvert in other ways. Let's talk about also what are the consequences of anger in each case. Didn't the Prophet ﷺ say he qualified? This isn't just the person who suppresses their anger. This is a person who has the authority and ability to harm other people. Yes. And they are the one that controls their anger. Right? So it's not just like the Prophet ﷺ is not talking about your run-of-the-mill, I spilled the milk in the kitchen sort of anger, right? We're talking about somebody who, can determine who lives and dies, right? Somebody who sends people to war, somebody who, holds a gun, something like that. Somebody who has the power and authority to injure, harm people, right? Or can make their lives absolutely miserable, right? Through, let's say, I don't know, like they control the purse strings, right? They're the head of the household. They are the person who brings in the money, right? And if they were petty, they could punish everybody else in accordance to their anger. No allowance for you, no money for you, no food for you. Here, you think that you're tough stuff? Here, you can have this crust of bread, right, for dinner tonight, and go to bed without right. These sorts of types of punishment. So the hadith specifically is about somebody who has the authority to inflict harm because of their anger. So somebody who has that authority and yet paired with that authority shows restraint, then they are going to be rewarded in this very particular way and honored in this very particular way. And this is something that is inhabited by men, right? The head of the household, in the sense that the absolute responsibility to secure livelihood, right? Food, shelter, clothing, that's the man's responsibility, full stop. If the woman wants to contribute, she is allowed, but that doesn't dangle anything over the head of the man. At the end of the day, the man has to provide these things, right? If he doesn't, the imam can separate, he can dissolve the marriage if he doesn't take care of these basic necessities, right? And so there's this person that there's this sort of asymmetry of power. I'll try to get back to that in a second, which isn't necessarily bad. But there's a further level of responsibility for the person who has that power. And thus there's a further level of reward for somebody who restrains themselves and restrains their anger within that context of having that authority and power, right? This is very, 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 very important when it comes to how does Islam understand power? Very, very different from how contemporary liberal society understands power. Contemporary liberal society views power as evil, almost unequivocally evil. We have the saying in English, power corrupts, right? That is not an Islamic orientation towards life and power, right? The Prophet ﷺ had power. He was not simply an insurgent movement. Yes, there was a time period of insurgency. There was a time period of being oppressed, but then he became the power. He became the head of state. He became the king or the president, whatever you want to say. And after he died, the next 4 or 5 companions, they were also righteous wielders of power. So we don't have this absolute asymmetry of power. Somebody's more powerful than somebody else. That absolutely means that there's oppression going on. No. But that person has a higher degree of responsibility. Yes, exactly. Within our religion, and that person is going to be dealt with more harshly in the afterlife because of the power that they had. Somebody can wield it for good. We believe that power can be wielded for good. We believe in the possibility of good power, right? And so this hadith is about good power. Somebody has power and they are clement, they are forbearing, they are merciful, they control their anger. That person has an enormous reward. Why is that reward gendered? Because that role is also gendered, right? This is the responsibility of men to take up these particular positions of authority and power. And it's also their responsibility to tame themselves and tame their anger, especially we're talking about the anger that's on their own behalf, right? So just the fact that there is asymmetrical power in a household, in a society, is not necessarily a bad thing when it comes to our tradition. However, the side that has the power, whether it's a single man within his household or the governor or the military or whatever it is, absolutely has to use that power for good. Yes, very good. And that does not mean that women are being degraded when that is the reward. And this gets back to your first point, right? About male and female desire, right? Like male and female desire is different, right? And without being absolutist, because one can always point out to what about this and what about that, and there are exceptions here and there, right? But let's just say that men have typically much higher sex drives than women, and they are much more motivated sexually than women. They are typically sexually aggressors or pursuers, right? And this is something that's universal. It's something that's hormonal. In fact, they've found, okay, if you really want to go off the deep end, okay, you can look into some of the firsthand accounts of, if you can stand to do so, of women who undergo hormone therapy to try to transition to become a man, right? So basically you have this person who had a certain hormonal makeup, and then they're messing with that, and they are introducing levels of testosterone that are very foreign to them. Their firsthand accounts of what it's like to have that much testosterone pumping through their body is very interesting. They basically were shocked and astonished by how much they wanted to pursue, right, sexual activity and attraction and romance and etc. And I'll spare the gory details, but you get the point, right? So these things are different. And somebody can say, well, not everybody, and this is a generalization, etc. But there are even discrepancies internationally, right? We have things in the United States and North America, such as the widespread dispersal of endocrine disruptors and other sorts of pharmaceuticals in our water that actually makes men have a lot less testosterone than other places in the world, right? They did some sort of sampling of testosterone levels in men in North America versus men in Egypt, I think, and they found that men in other places where there weren't nearly as many pharmaceuticals and endocrine disruptors in the water had much more higher levels of testosterone, right? So there's a chemical thing to this, right? Laysa dhakaru kal untha, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created male and he created female. He created them as two complementary parts, neither of them whole by themselves. And each of them has different motivations and different desires, right? When it comes to men, men tend to be way more motivated by this sort of romantic intrigue and attraction and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not to say that women don't have that side of attraction to them. Of course they do, but it's not nearly pronounced, as pronounced typically as it is for men. And women have other things that are stronger forces of attraction to them, right? It's a stereotype, right? We have stereotypes like this within our culture, within media and sitcoms and comedy, right? A woman can not be intimate with, or she can't, like, if she's having an argument with her husband, right, and she feels slighted in some sort of way, or undervalued, or not listened to, then she literally cannot bring herself to have intimacy with her husband, right? That's a fairly well-established, observable fact and stereotype. However, the man, on the other hand, it doesn't matter how bad of an argument they've had, almost, it doesn't matter how bad of an argument they've had. I guarantee you that the man, if it comes down to being intimate, is ready and willing to forgive and forget in order to have intimacy, right? This shows you something very, very telling about gender and sexuality across gender difference, that, you know, there's something much more maybe complicated or spread out when it comes to attraction in women than when it comes to attraction or motivation in men. And Allah knows best. Right? These are all generalizations. Okay, we went far afield. Let's see. What else? Okay, we talked about that. We talked about that. Yes, we talked about the consequences of male anger versus female anger, that the consequences of male anger might end up wreaking havoc on society and nations. It might cause war, right? All these sorts of things that men tend to be in control of or responsible for, as opposed to women. Oh, and the last part that was left untouched was the deconstructing what it means to be rewarded with a virgin. Right, this is something that, because hurul ain, right, is literally translated as like wide-eyed damsels, but in the Quran we do have like وَجَعَلْنَاهُنَّ أَبْكَارًا, right? We made them into virgins, right? So we do have this thing that they are virgins. Now, a Western person coming from a Western background reads this sort of thing and they're very, very disturbed, right? They think that this is just some sort of fetish or some sort of whatever you want to say, like some sort of it has to do with the experience of intimacy and etc., etc. But there's something much more deep and profound going on here when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises virgins to the believing men in paradise. And that is, and honestly, like, perhaps nobody can appreciate it except somebody that comes from a background outside of Islam, where you see that most non-Muslims, they have multiple intimate partners before they get married, right? And so for a person who has had multiple intimate partners before they get married, there's always this kind of background uneasiness, right? People are always worried or anxious about being compared to people previously, right? Am I as good as them, either in very kind of crude terms, like when it comes to intimacy and performance, or when it comes to other sorts of things like personality, like helping out, etc. And the worst kind of scenarios, when somebody gets into a fight, there will be couples that bring these things up. They'll, oh, I should have never left so and so, like things were better with them, and etc., etc., etc. Right? So much more than a kind of a physical fetish, this is something that has to do with the tranquility of the soul. Right? Keep in mind that paradise is free from worry, free from anxiety, free from fear, right? What does Allah say in Surah Al-Waqi'ah? He says, لا يسمعون فيها لغوا ولا تأثيما إلا قيلا سلاما سلاما, right? That there is nothing displeasing in paradise, right? And it's a much more important than anything going on physically to be concerned and worried about measuring up or stacking up to a previous relationship or a previous partner or spouse, etc., etc., is one of the most unnerving things that a person can go through, and one of the most undermining things, and one of the biggest sources of anxiety and kind of erosion of self-confidence, right? So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises, and this is even more important perhaps for men who are, we really, really like to be respected and like to be kind of reassured that we're doing a good job. And it's very, very painful and hurtful for a man to think that he's not kind of like, to feel unappreciated, or to be kind of cut down or compared to somebody else in kind of a negative way, right? So for this sort of situation, you know, it really represents psychological tranquility, right? That if somebody has never been with anybody else before, they've never been intimate or in a relationship with anybody else before, then this is a level of psychological tranquility that is unmatched, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he is promising virgins in paradise, right, it has to do with this kind of erasure of the fear of being compared, erasure of the fear of being belittled or being inadequate, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Welcome, Samira. You entered into a very, very loaded, fraught topic. We're talking about the Hur al-Ain and what it signifies. Wa alaikum assalam. Okay. Yes. Anyone have any questions about that? Let's pause for questions before we go on. Any objections? Any feminist readings that would rather erase the existence of the Hur al-Ain? This is an important point epistemologically, right? The difference between Islam and every other religious tradition or textual tradition is that in Islam, we decide, or we have decided, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has shown us what is evidence, and we follow the evidence to wherever it leads. Whereas previous communities that have gone before us, such as Christianity and such as Judaism, etc., etc., there was always a point within their within their religious history that they decided on the conclusions, and then they worked backwards to manipulate the evidence in order to prove those conclusions that they had already arrived to. There you go. And Sister Asma, the OG, mashallah, men can have their huris. I will take peace reading a good book under a tree. Ya salam. MashaAllah. Everybody has their thing, right? Everybody has what is peace to them. And the general principle is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to give the inhabitants of paradise what is most relaxing and what is most pleasing to them. There's actually a story from somebody, another imam that I know, where he worked in the inner city, right? And when you work in the inner city, you deal with all sorts of people, and so he heard someone in the masjid say, man, I can't wait when I get to Jannah, I'm going to smoke crack. And the imam was very taken aback and shocked and surprised, and debated whether to say anything or not, and then decided against it because, okay, this person believes that, I mean, hey, there's khamr, right? There's alcohol that has been purified so that it doesn't have the negative effects of what it has in this life. So I guess it's not beyond rational possibility that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could provide something in a purified way to the inhabitants of Jannah. Who are we to limit the bounty and mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Anyway, let's see, where are we at? We got 5 more minutes. Okay, can we do one more? Okay, yeah, this one's short. Yes, number 48, very short. The famous Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu said, a man came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for advice, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to him, "La taghdab, do not get angry." Okay, the man, not kind of taking this advice very seriously, is like, okay, what else? What else? But the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not going to let him go that easily. He kept on repeating, "La taghdab," like, do not get angry. And obviously, we're not given the entire full context of what's going on here, because there had to be something the Prophet ﷺ knew about this person. And this is the min nahiyat al-fatawa, right? The Prophet ﷺ dealt with people based off of their individual situations. And he knew their individual situations. When it came to one man asking, was he allowed to kiss his wife during fasting? He said, yes, you can. And then somebody else came and asked the same question. He said, no, you can't, right? Because the first guy was an old man. He, was past his prime. And the second guy was a young guy and was, full of energy, etc., etc. So the Prophet ﷺ knew people's situation, and he knew something about this individual that he really, really needed to hear, that he had to struggle with his anger. And this teaches us something very, very important about the flexibility or the plasticity of our behaviors, right? Many people, in order to kind of escape accountability, they lean on these sorts of platitudes that we have in society, right? That's just who I am. Oh, and I get angry, I curse. Right? And maybe you guys aren't aware of this. I'm not sure how much it happens in the Muslim community, but in the non-Muslim community, this is very, very common, right? That's just who I am. Yeah, I get I'm short-tempered, right? I have a short fuse. Oh, I have that Italian blood, or that, hot blood, etc., etc. And of course, that's not to say that these things are true, in as much as they represent your starting point, right? Some people do have shorter tempers than others. Some people are more patient than others. But these things are weaponized and utilized as excuses for poor behavior and used to escape accountability, right? Islam is against making a sin or a sinful behavior an identity. Fundamental point. Islam is against making sin or sinful behavior an identity. And this is obviously exactly what the homosexual community has done, right? Well, that's just who I am, right? We don't care. Islam, we don't care that that's who you think you are. You can change who you are. You didn't just come out unchangeable, right? If you take the majority of non-Muslim men, they would love to have an affair with somebody. They would love to cheat on their wives or their spouses or their girlfriends, or etc. Right? Is that just who they are? Right? Every single, and this is what makes our modern era so fundamentally different from the eras that came before, going across religious traditions, is that in the pre-modern world, every religious tradition taught that you are not the same thing as your desires. You go into Buddhist texts, you go into Hindu texts, you go into Christian texts, you go into Jewish texts, you go into Muslim texts. You are not your desires. Your desires are separate from you. And your work, your habitus, as Aristotle said, in this world, is to struggle and work against your desires in order to create pathways of habit that are virtuous. That's how you develop virtue, by struggling against your urges and your impulses, right? It's only very, very, very recently where people have attempted to avoid this project and lazily kind of avoid all accountability by saying whatever, and this is from Kant and the Enlightenment and after him, whatever desire I have, whatever thing that appears within myself is who I am, fundamentally. And if I don't express that thing and act on it, it is a fundamental oppression of myself, a bottling up. You can basically, you're at fault. Like I might be liable to commit suicide, and it'll be all your fault, right? Because you're the one who's repressed me and tried to repress my internal urges, right? That's what we're told today. A very, very dangerous way of looking at things. That's right. Oh, of course, we become worse than animals, Asma. We become worse than animals because the animals don't do anything but obey Allah, right? Whereas us, we are literally making up platitudes and philosophies and ideologies in order to justify our worst inclinations. And with the devil, and we've noticed how the devil works, there is no horizon. The goalposts keep moving. Desire, there's no end to human desire. Don't think that, now men are marrying men and women are marrying women, and that's just the end of it. Never. There's always another frontier. There's always going to be something else, because the devil, that's how he works. Slowly, 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 by pushing desire. And human desire knows no bounds. The Prophet ﷺ, he said this himself. He said that if man were given a valley of gold, he would want a second one, right? There is absolutely no satisfaction. We think, and this is the Kantian kind of post-enlightenment kind of mentality, that if we act on our urges and desires, we fulfill them and satisfy ourselves. No. That's not how desire works. Desire must be trained. Desire must be disciplined. And that's the only way to satisfy it, right? Through the focusing and funneling of it into one legitimate, productive end, not the kind of undisciplined, just, splattering it all over the place here and there and everywhere. No. So this is one of the philosophically more fundamentally dangerous things that we have right now. And this hadith is a subtle but tangential and powerful reminder against that. In Islam, it's not an excuse. Whatever you feel inside of you, it's not an excuse. That's not who you are. You are more than that. And you are also partly unrealized potential, right? And so we don't just take how we are now as finished products and as, right? We're complete selves, whole selves, and therefore it's sacred. And this is why I keep coming back to this point, and forgive me for repeating myself, but the idol of our time is the self. It's not the sticks and stones. It's not Jesus Christ. It's not, Krishna or anything else. In the first world, whatever you want to call it, the developed world, the colonial world, whatever you want to call it, the idol is the self. We have turned the self into an idol. Everything the self feels is sacred. You can't question it, right? I'm attracted to this. Who are you to question it? Are you a bigot? Are you trying to oppress me? Are you telling me that I don't deserve to experience the same satisfaction as somebody else just because my desires are different? The self is not sacred. That's what our tradition teaches, is that the self is meant to be disciplined, not to be put up as a golden calf and worshipped and imagine that everything that it comes up with is like revelation, that you can't touch it. And that's where we'll end for tonight. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, reflections? I mean, Okay. If that's all, then I hope all of you are having a wonderful Eid. May Allah accept your worship. And we will see you next time, inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.